Hello quilters, and welcome to Let's Make a Quilt Together once again. The block we're going to work on today is the double wedding ring block, and I'm excited about this because this is a chance to make this very traditional block using African fabrics. And so this is what we are going to be working on. That's our traditional double wedding ring block. But we bring some real pizzazz to this block by using African fabrics to construct it. And so I want you to know that you're going to be using templates. I have a set of templates that I'll show you. And I also want you to know how you're going to cut this out. And so before we get to the templates, I'm going to show you what you need in order to make this quilt block. And I'm giving you the information based on the templates that I used. Your templates may have a different designation, but once I show you where every piece is, I think it'll make sense to you. In order to make this block, we have these pieces here. These are called A pieces. And each one of the arcs, the top arc and the bottom arc, in each section uses 4 of these A pieces. So altogether you will cut out 32 A pieces. Then the pieces here that are almost at the end of the block, both here and here, are called B pieces. And you will cut 16 B pieces. All of this will make sense as we go through the making of the block. Then we have these 2 pieces here, one on the end of each lower arc. Those are D pieces, and we need to cut 8 of those. Then we have template C. Template C is the football-shaped template that you see here, and we need to cut 4 of those. And the very last one is template E, and we cut 1 of those. Notice that I chose to cut C and E from the same fabric. You may choose to do something else. You may want this one to be different from that one, however you want to do it. This block itself lends itself for a lot of creativity and a lot of diversity. And let's say that you want to make it without all of the little A's and B's that are in it. There is a template in this set, template H. It might be hard for you to see. I'll just hold this up. Template H is the same size as each of these arcs. So you could cut a solid piece of fabric using template H and not have to sew all of these little pieces together the way I have done. You just cut the whole arc out. It's the same for the top and the bottom. Then you would need to cut out D's, but it would be a lot less sewing because you would have fewer pieces. You wouldn't have the A's and the B's. However, I did it this way so that in the event that you want to do it with all of the smaller pieces, you could use this video to help you to do that. Now we're ready to get into it, and so that you can make your double wedding ring block. Hello quilters. We're working on the double wedding ring quilt block. And I wanted to share with you a little bit of information about a set of templates. This block is pretty much very difficult to make if you don't have templates. I'm not sure what your templates are like and exactly how they are laid out. But I'm going to share how mine are so that as I go through the process, you know exactly what I'm talking about as I use each template. And the first template I'm going to call your attention to is the big one. It might be a little hard for you to see, but the big one is our background fabric. And in my set, this is template E. The other template that we will use to cut background fabric is the one shaped like a football. And you will need to cut 4 of these. And in my set, this is template C. And let me go back to the first one. Using this template, you only need to cut 1 of your background fabric. Then we're going to move to the templates that we use for the arcs. The first one is template F. You can lay F down on 2 or 3 fabrics and cut it at one time, cut all of them at one time. Because F is what we're going to use when we get ready to cut A. I want you to notice how A fits on F. So the first thing you're going to do is cut several F's so that you can cut A from it. And you will need 32 A's for one block. Each arc has 4 of these A shapes in them. And so, since you have 8 arcs, you will need 32 A's. And that means if you will cut, I think it's 4 of the F's, you can get the 32 A's that you need cut from the F. And when I get ready to do this, I will demonstrate it for you. The next shape is the B shape. And once again, we have template G, and we cut several of those, and then we will lay template B, excuse me, then we're going to lay template B on Then we lay template B on template G, and we cut out the B's from the piece of fabric that we used G to cut out. And it's important to do that because you need that little curved edge at the bottom of each B. And so cut the G out first, then lay B on the G that you've cut out, and you'll get the number of B's that you need. And you will need a total of 16. The next one that I need you to know about is D. D is at the end of each arc, and so since there are 8 arcs, we need 8 D's. Now, if you were going to make this block without sewing your arcs, you could use template H to just cut this from a piece of fabric, sew it together using the process I'm going to demonstrate, and it would be just a one color arc, and you wouldn't have all of the fabrics in it composed of A's and B's. So you will decide, you've seen both, and you decide which way you want to make yours. Now in front of me, I have an array of my African fabrics. These are little pieces. Some of them are in strips, some of them are not. And some I'm just going to cut straight from the fabric as it is, because I don't have enough to cut a strip as the directions tell me, but they're the very directions I'm going to give you in the event that you do have enough. But I'm just going to use these African fabrics that I have here. Some of them are scraps, most of them are just little pieces that are left from previous projects, and I just want to cut them up and use them in this project. Now, when you begin to cut using your templates, a rotary cutter like this, that really big rotary cutter, that 60 rotary cutter, is not very good to use with your templates because you have such small areas to get around with some of these templates. So what you want to do is go into your supplies, get a smaller rotary cutter, and if you're fortunate enough, there are some that are even smaller than this that will work even better for you. And so I even have one that's smaller. I don't know that I need to go to this size, but you can see the differences in the sizes of blades, and the smaller blade works better going around the template. Another nice to have while you're doing this project is a cutting board that rotates, because that makes it easier for you to move around these small pieces without actually disturbing your fabric. So if you have one of these, that's a nice to have. It works very well with this project. If you don't have one of those, perhaps you have just a little cutting board that you can lay on top of your big cutting board and move it so that you don't have to disturb the template and the fabric while you're cutting. So these are just a few tips that I can share with you before we get started, and then demonstrate as we're going through the process. Okay, I'm starting with template D that goes on the end of each arc, and I've cut one using my scraps here and my rotating cutting board. And let me show you what I did by cutting another. Ordinarily, if you're using large pieces of fabric, you would cut a 3-inch strip in order to cut these D pieces out. But I'm not using large pieces of fabric, I'm using scraps. And so I don't have that. I just have my little scrap and my little rotary cutter that is very convenient for this process. And my rotating cutting board. This just makes it so much easier, and nothing disturbs our fabric. And remember, I've told you before, sometimes when we have mistakes in our quilts, they start right here at the beginning with the cutting. And so there's the second one. And I'm going to continue to cut these out. I need 4 of these. So I'm going to continue to cut them out and then come back to you. Okay, I have cut the 4 D shapes that I need, and here they are right here. So I can set these aside until I'm ready to sew. One thing I didn't mention that I should have, you want to make sure you cut these on the straight of grain. It can be the up and down grain, or it can be the crosswise grain. But either way, this template requires us to cut the fabric on the straight of grain. So remember that for that end piece. And that's going to go at the end of each arc. Okay, so now we're going to cut A. And I have some fabrics here that I've sort of lined up in order to cut A. Now traditionally with the double wedding ring, fabrics are sorted by hue. Most of the time when you see this pattern, the darker fabrics are at the end of the arc, lighter fabrics in the middle. The A shape is in the middle. There are 4 A shapes in each arc, and then there are 2 B shapes on the end of each arc, which will put the lighter fabrics in the middle, darker fabrics on the end. So I have some light scraps here, and I'm going to start by cutting these using the A template. And once again, remember, I'm not cutting strips from large pieces of fabric. These are scraps, and so I'm going to treat them as such, but I'll be able to get all of the pieces out of them that I need. And as I cut, I'm cutting them to make sure I have right sides up. I don't need any mirror images as such. I just want right sides up. Here is the little A template that I'm going to use, and I just lay this on here so that I can cut it and get just what I need. Ordinarily, you would cut template F, lay it down, and then cut the A's from it. But I don't have that much fabric here. I'm only using scraps. So I'm just going to cut the A from the scraps, but I have to make sure that I cut it with this little arc at the bottom. That's what is so crucial. So let's see if we can cut A out while you're with me. And I'm using my small cutting wheel. I love the fact that these templates are so nice and thick. They're 1/8 of an inch thick. And I'm using my revolving cutting board so that I don't have to disturb anything. And that helps me to be a little more accurate. Also, with these templates, the 1/4 of an inch seam allowance is already included in the template. So that's not a concern that I have either. I know that I'm going to have enough fabric cut that I will be able to allow for a 1/4 of an inch seam allowance. And notice that by turning the board, I didn't have to move this little piece. And so I have cut 2 A's just like that. And I'm going to continue to cut A. Remember, I need 32 of these for one block. So I'm going to continue to cut, and then I will have you to come back and join me once I have done that. Welcome back. And you can see here on my cutting board, I've cut the 16 B fabrics that I need, or B shapes. And they too are scrappy. Remember, I'm just using scraps, African scraps that I have. And I wanted these to be darker than the A's that I cut. And you can see we do get that contrast. That these are going to be light and the A's are in the middle of the arc. The B's are on the end of the arc and they're a little bit dark. So we've cut the A's, the B's, and now we need to cut that oval shaped like a football that goes between the arcs. And our very last cut will be the background. So I've cut 2 strips of fabric that are 2 1/4 inch wide. I've got my C template, and I'm just going to lay the C template on the 2 strips. I can cut 2 of these at a time. I can really cut all 4 of them if I just fold this. I'm not sure about that little rotary cutter. It may not do well with 4 layers of fabric. So we will just put the football on these 2 strips and cut it out. Now with these templates, you can put dots on the back of them to keep them from sliding, because they do have a tendency to do that. And you know, the same dots that you put on the back of your ruler to keep it from sliding, you could do that to your templates as well. Because you want your cut to be as accurate as you can possibly make it. And you'll notice I'm still using my little rotary cutting board so that I don't have to disturb the fabric or the template in order to complete the cuts. And I'm glad I didn't try to go through 4 layers of fabric, because this rotary cutter is having a difficult time with 2 layers. But here are the first 2 ovals that I need. And I'll put those right there. And then I can cut 2 more. And the very last thing I'm going to cut will be the big piece that goes in the middle. It's the background. And I want you to notice that the ovals and the background are cut out of the same fabrics. Okay, let's get this one cut. Oh, success. Okay, so now I have my 4 football shapes, and I will set those aside while I cut the one background shape that I need. And I cut a strip of fabric that is 10 inches wide. And I'm going to just lay the template on this piece of fabric to cut out the background. And this is template E, and it just lays right here on this 10-inch strip. I only need one since I'm only making one double wedding ring block. And I think I can do this better by standing, so I need to get out of the chair and stand to do this. I'm still using my small rotary cutter because it helps with going around the curves of these templates. My favorite rotary cutter is the really big one. I love that. And I use it for everything else, but it didn't make much sense to try to use it for this. I'm going to fold this here so I can turn it and make the next cut. And there we have it. There's our background piece, and we are ready to go to the sewing machine and begin to sew our block together. And so just so you get an idea of what to expect, when we put these together, we have an oval here, here, here at the bottom, and I'm leaving space because we're going to have those arcs where these spaces are. And the arcs will be made up of our light and dark fabrics for A and B. So I'll just stick some fabrics here. Doesn't matter. Remember, mine is scrappy. Doesn't really matter where I put what. I'm not, trying to make it matchy-matchy. I've got all these wonderful fabrics here that I'm going to use. And I love the contrast of these fabrics and the background fabric. Move it up a little bit so I can see if I can get things on the table. Yep. And of course, since nothing is sewn yet, you won't be able to see it as accurately as I would like. But, that will come once we get to sewing. But we have to build arcs on both sides of the football. And we will use all of these fabrics that have been cut. And remember that there should be 4 A's on each side of and then a B is going to be here. But remember, they won't all fit right now because nothing has been sewn. And I may even change this arrangement just before I sew it, but I wanted you to get an idea of where you were going with completing this block. And you can see how the scrappy look is coming about. And I'm beginning to truly like it. It's good when you create something and you like what you create. I think I will move this guy and just try it over there. And okay, those are the A's. And then we have to get the B's so that you can see the contrast. The B's are darker. And you see what's happening with that. And because of space, I can't get all of the B's. Oh, there's an A that, 1, 2, 3, 4. Oh, that's the problem. Here we go. B. Can't get everything on because nothing has been sewn and the seam allowance gets in the way. And all of you are aware of that. But you can see the block taking shape. And there should be another B there. And we get a B here. And I'll take this and put this here on this end. And this one on this end. And we get a B here. Right there. And all the B's get laid down. They don't look like they fit right now, but I can guarantee you they will fit once all of the seam allowances have been sewn. Here we go. And of course this one has to go here. Okay, it's a place for all of them. And then of course the last thing is going to be this particular piece that connects the two arcs. But it's kind of hard to see that now because things need to be sewn. But you get an idea of what the block will look like. And pretty soon we move to the sewing machine and you can see, I'll start putting it together so that you can see what it should be like when it's sewn. Now I think you can see a little bit more of it this way. Okay, so my next job is to go set up my sewing machine and begin to sew this together. Now I'll tell you exactly what I'm going to do. The first thing I have to do is sew the A's together. And I'm going to sew A's together for each side of each arc. I will attach the B to each end of each arc. And I'll do that for all of the arcs. Now we've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 arcs. I'm going to sew all of the arcs together. Then when I have finished sewing those together, I'll sew the oval to the two arcs that have been made. Once that unit is complete, we're ready to sew the unit to each of these units to the background fabric. So the sewing really isn't that much. It's just that we have to be very careful. This is another one of those blocks where you want to make sure you use 1/4 of an inch seam allowance. It doesn't allow you to use more. It doesn't really allow you to use less. So make sure your sewing machine is set up in such a way that you can guarantee yourself a 1/4 of an inch seam allowance, because that's crucial. The other thing you want to do is sew things together in order. I know how I want the A's to be, so I'm going to sew all of these A's together in the middle of the arc first, and then attach B to each end. That helps me to keep things in order. There is also a template included in this group that once the arc is sewn, if you lay what you've sewn on this particular template H, it should be the same size, which is a really good measurement for accountability, so that you know your seam is correct when that arc, when all of what you've sewn fits directly down on that particular template. So that's a good way to help yourself to not get a seam allowance that's too off. You really want to be careful. You really want to use a 1/4 of an inch seam allowance, even a scant 1/4 of an inch seam allowance, for those of you who are familiar with that. So the next time I see you, we will be at the sewing machine. Welcome back, quilters. Now we're together and I'm at the sewing machine. And the first thing we need to do when we begin to put the double wedding ring block together is to sew the arcs. And I have some pieces laying here on my little cutting board. These are the B's on the end. You remember we talked about those. These are A's in here. So every arc will have a B at the end and 4 A's in the middle, so that you're going to sew 6 pieces together. When we have completed that, we're going to sew these D's onto the end. So let me get started showing you how to stitch this together. Make sure you have a pressing station next to your sewing machine, because as you sew these, you will want to press the seam. You can either press that seam open, as I did on one of mine, or you can press it to the right or the left, but be consistent in your pressing. If you start to press on one of your arcs, the seam allowance going to the left, then all of the seam allowances for that arc should go to the left. And if you start at the right, then of course it ensues that all of them will be pressed to the left. Okay, I've picked up a B and an A, and I'm going to stitch those together. Make sure you have a pressing station near you to do this, because this requires a lot of pressing in order to get this together. Now I'm going to assembly line sew these because it's faster and it saves on thread. So I'll pick up 2 more pieces, lay them right sides together, and run them through the sewing machine. You can pin if you want. These are such small pieces, I've just opted not to pin. But those of you that have been with me before know that I really do subscribe to using pins. All right, I'll pick up the last 2 pieces for this arc and run them through the sewing machine. Then I can take these off, press them, and sew them together to make the complete arc. Be sure that as you're stitching, you're maintaining a 1/4 of an inch seam allowance. Can't stress that enough, because we're working with not only straight edges, but you have curves in this. And it's imperative that you have the right seam allowance to make these curves fit one within the other. We're going to be sewing convex curves into concave curves, and we want to make sure that all of our curves will fit. And one of the ways to ensure that is to make sure you're using a 1/4 inch seam allowance. Okay, I'm going to press these two. I press from the right side, and in this case, the seam allowance is being pressed toward my left. So that means that all of the seam allowances for this particular arc will be pressed to the left. I've done the same thing for all of my arcs, though, that I did. This is just a sample one. Now, in order to put them together, to make sure that they're in the right order, I'm looking for this little arc that runs around here. There should be a slight curve denoting an arc on the bottom. And so when I know that my pieces line up and I can see that curve, then I know that my pieces are put together correctly. So I can put right sides together. Now, if you're uncomfortable assembly line sewing, that's fine. Sew two, take it off of the sewing machine, press. Sew two more, take that off of the sewing machine and press. And sew two more and take that off of the sewing machine and press. And then sew them together. Please always, always do what is comfortable for you. And I'm going to press this one now. Then I'll take the other one off of the sewing machine and press it so that I can sew all of the arc together. Okay, I'm going to sew the last two pieces onto this arc. And you see our curve right here. So I know that my pieces are being put together accurately. Right sides together, and then we will stitch these last two pieces together to make this particular arc. Okay, and one last pressing, and we will be done with this arc. Okay, I want you to see all of my seam allowances have been pressed in one direction. I hope you can see that. That's going to make it a lot easier for me when I have to do some more stitching. I have to put the football shape here, and then I would have, if I were making a whole quilt, I would have another block to attach here. So you want to make sure all of those seam allowances are going in the same direction. All right, now as you make this block, every one of the footballs has two arcs, an upper arc and a lower arc. And here's one of those units that I've sewn together. Here is the upper arc, here is the lower arc. Our directions tell us that after we sew the two arcs together, upper arc is sewn, lower arc is sewn before we put the football in. We have to attach um, the piece that you get from template B. Template D. And we're going to attach that to the lower arc. And I'm going to demonstrate that for you right now. I've got my arc. There are the 6 pieces. Here's a B, here's a B, here are the 4 A's. Now you see this piece. There's a D, here's a D. And so we're going to sew those D's onto the arc that I just completed. And you want to go very slowly with this. Truly take your time because you want to make sure they fit as perfectly as possible. One of the things I want to call to your attention is you see that you have a slight curve on the end of B. And when you look at D, there is a matching curve. This is the concave curve. This is the convex curve. And they fit together just like that. And that's the way you want to sew yours so that they will fit. So I'm going to put right sides together. I'm not going to use pins. I'm going to just make sure I have right sides together. This little point should extend 1/4 of an inch beyond the bottom of the curve. And I'm going to put them down. And I have a 1/4 of an inch presser foot. If you don't have that, whatever you're using to help you maintain 1/4 of an inch seam allowance, make sure you're using it this time. And in my case, I want to make sure that both edges, edge of the D and the edge of the arc are together. And so you have to sew very slowly to make sure you get the curve in there. When you have finished sewing this seam, the seam should be slightly curved. And what you want to do is constantly make sure those 2 edges are together. And it means you have to maneuver a little bit. And so you sew slowly, taking just a few stitches at a time, so that you can get those edges to meet. And if you constantly concentrate on meeting the edges, you will get that little curve that is in there. And that curve is very important. It's slight, but it needs to be there. You don't want this to come out as a straight seam. If it does, then you will want to call on your friend, your seam ripper, take it out and stitch it again. And by all means, take your time. Do just what you see me doing now. Go slowly so that those edges will meet. And when I finish this, I'll take it off of the sewing machine so you can see it. Okay, let's see if I got the curve in there. Yes. All right. You see the slight curve? Here's the seam. Of course, this fabric is kind of busy and it might be hard to see. But as you look down this seam, it does curve a little bit, and I'm going to press it, and that might make it easier for you to see it. And by the way, this seam allowance is pressed in the same direction as all of the other seam allowances on the arc. And there you can see that slight curve that I was talking about. Okay, we've gotten one D piece on the arc. Now it's time to put the other D piece on the arc. Right sides together, same thing that we did the last time. The difference is this time I have to sew it this way from the back or from the arc side. And that's a little bit more challenging for me. It may not be for you. But remember, our little point sticks out 1/4 of an inch beyond the bottom of the arc. And so Let's get this one sewn. And this is a place where you will hear me say you may not want to pin it. You just want to take your time and do 1 or 2 stitches at a time to make sure it's lining up the way it should. And keep the edges together slowly. I find that there are several facets of putting this block together that really do require you to go very slowly to maintain accuracy. And this is one of them. Okay, we press it and we'll look for our little arc, our little bend in the seam, in the seam. Yep. And once again, there you can see that slight bend right there. See the seam allowance. You see the bend right here that we have to work to keep. Now, this would be your bottom arc. You have attached a D to one end of the arc and a D to the other end of the arc. And once you have completed that with the bottom arc, you're ready to start sewing the whole unit together that has the top arc and the bottom arc. And that's what we're going to do next. Okay, now our goal is to put the arcs and the footballs together. And here you will see that I've created one of those arcs and football units that really create the double wedding ring design. Notice here, that's part D. Over here is another D. We know that here's our bottom arc and the top arc. And I have 2 arcs to put together with the football shape, and I want to show you how to sew those together. First of all, here's our top arc and the football shape. The first thing we need to do is establish the center of that football shape. So I am going to fold it in half. Now you can do this in a variety of ways. This is just the way that works for me. You could have put a mark on it when you first cut it. You could have done a lot of things. You can cut a little notch right here where I'm folding it. You could cut a notch right there and there. I just choose not to cut a notch. I just give it a good crease in that spot. And that lets me know that I have to match that crease. Can you see the crease? With the middle seam allowance on the top arc. And so I have to match these 2 places to make sure I get this arc exactly where it should be. And since I have 6 pieces in the arc, I know that the seam allowance between the 3rd and 4th piece is where I need to match that fold. So putting right sides together, I'm going to match the 2, and I hope you can see this, and put a pin there. Now I turned it around because I find it easier when I'm sewing a convex curve into a concave curve. It's easier to sew from the side of the convex curve. And so I'm putting the pins on this side. I'm going to extend my little football shape so that the point is out at the end of the arc, and put a pin there. And then I'll extend it to the other end. And you can see right there, if I can get it on the camera, you can see what I mean by extending that point to the end of the arc. And that I'm going to pin. Now, by nature, convex curves don't really want to fit into these concave curves. So to help them stretch just a little bit, I'm going to clip along the edge of this curve. All right, I'm going to clip along this edge, and I want to make sure I do not go beyond the seam line. Remember, we have to maintain a 1/4 of an inch seam line, so I'm just making tiny little snips. That way, as I sew around this curve, I can assure myself, excuse me, that this background fabric will fit nicely into the curve. The concave curve will fit into the convex curve will fit nicely into the concave curve. And I will not have destroyed anything beyond the seam allowance. I want you to see the results of my snips here. See if I can hold that so you can see it. I don't know if you, yeah, there you go. You can see the little snips. So now I want to put a few more pins in, and this is where I'm generous with pins, because when I sew this, I only want to sew it once. Okay, let's get this sewn. And once again, make sure you're using something that helps you to maintain a 1/4 of an inch seam allowance. Sometimes you have to reach under and make sure that fabric is exactly where it should be. The double wedding ring block is a series of sewing curves together. Concave curves are being fitted to convex curves throughout this whole process. And so you want to be aware of that, and you want to make sure that when you're stitching, you don't lose those curves. Don't turn a curved seam into a straight seam. And one of the ways you can ensure that is to do what I'm doing. Take your time, snip the fabric, and sew very slowly. They will fit, they were meant to fit, but sometimes they don't think they were meant to fit, and you have to convince them that they were. And I'm getting around to the end. Okay, let's see how we did, and I don't want any pleats back here on the concave side. And we don't have any pleats or gathers, and we're ready to press. And when you press this seam, press it toward our football shape. Press your seam allowance toward the football shape. You're going to do that when you attach the bottom arc as well. And make sure you give it a good pressing. I do use steam. And here is the first arc attached to our football shape. To complete this unit, I'm going to attach the bottom arc. And remember, the bottom arc has our two D's attached to it. And I'll pin these together. Now that I've pressed it, I've lost my little crease. So let me put the crease back in the football fabric. And I should stop calling it football fabric, in the football shape. I need that little crease in there so that I can match it with the middle seam. And here we go. 1, 2, 3, yes, right here. And once again, I'm going to sew from this side, the side of the convex curve. And so I'll pin from that side. You noticed how smoothly the first one went together? This one should do the same thing. And also, I don't snip right away. I snip once I get everything partially pinned. And that's because I don't want any raveling. And if you handle fabric a lot after you've snipped it, sometimes those little snips will begin to ravel, or unravel, I should say. And we don't want that to happen. So that's the reason that I don't snip before I get some of my pinning done. Okay, snipping time. And once again, our little snips are going around over the curve, but I make sure that they're short and they do not get into the seam allowance. I'm just doing this so that the fabric will stretch just a little bit for me. As I stitch around that curve, I can pull this top fabric, this convex curve, and it will give just a little bit at those snips, and that's all I need. Many of you have done this if you've put Drunkard's Path together or any quilt block that requires you to put a concave and convex curve together. And so now that it's snipped, I can tug on it a little bit, get the pins in, and make sure everything is just where it should be so that I don't have any problems when I stitch it. And remember, I only want to stitch this once. I do not want to have to come back and stitch this one more time. So I'm going to take my time, stitch it once, move on to the next step in putting this block together. That's the goal. So you will use as many pins as that make you comfortable with what you're doing as I do. Now, when I get to the end, to start it and to end it, I have to make sure I pull the top arc around to meet the side of D. And that's what I'm doing now. I'm making sure that I'm matching the side of the top arc, and I have to get within the camera range, getting the side arc to match with D. Here we go. This is D on the bottom arc, and I want the top arc to come around and match with the end of D. And when I get to that point, I'm going to stitch this the exact same way as I stitched when I put the D onto the bottom arc. And you do have to kind of wriggle the fabric and twist and turn the fabric a little bit to get everything where it should be. Just take your time with this. For those of you with lots and lots of patience, this is a block you might be able to do in one sitting. For those of us who have less patience, well, we may need to use several sittings to get it done. Okay, here we go. And remember, just as before, I have to make sure these edges are together so that I don't lose the curve between the arc and part D or piece D. And you do want to take your pins out as you get to them. You don't want to stitch over your pins. That's not good for your sewing machine or the needle in the sewing machine. And we're rounding the corner. We've almost come to where the arc, top arc and D meet. And then once we sew that, we will be through with this seam. Okay. And we want the edges to meet, just like we did before. Okay. And we look for pleats or gathers. I don't see any. And I think I'm ready to press. Yes. Okay, I'm going to press this and then show you what this unit looks like. And remember, I'm pressing the seam allowance toward the football shape, not the arc. Both seam allowances in this unit are pressed toward that football shape. And here is our completed unit. You can see the D shapes on each end, and you see the bottom arc and the top arc. And the next thing we're going to do is sew these units to the background fabric. Welcome back. Now it's time to put each of the units, the arcs, the football shape, and the bottom arc, top arc, football shape units together with E. And E is the big piece that we have. That's our background fabric. Before you start sewing, I've put one on just so you could see it. Before you start sewing, there are some things you want to do with E first. You want to measure on each corner on the wrong side. Measure 1/4 of an inch from the top and 1/4 of an inch between each side, and put a dot there. You see the white dot that I have there, and you put that in each of the 4 corners, and it's in these 2 corners as well, but I have already sewn that, so it's hard to see, but that's crucial. The other thing you're going to do is identify the center. You know, I identified the center with a crease, and here's my crease right here. You may not be able to see it, but by folding it, I get a crease right there, and I know that that's the center. And you have to do that on all 4 sides. You have to identify the center for all 4 sides. You might want to mark it. You might want to put a crease in it, as I have done. You may want to clip a little notch. Whatever works for you, you need to identify the center of each side. So you've got your dots in the corners, they're crucial, and you have your center identified. And so since I have sewn one of our units on, now I'm going to sew the next unit on, and I want you to watch as I do that. It's just like what you saw before, however. It's the same thing as sewing the arc to this piece to the arc. We still have to get that convex curve into a concave curve. That's our challenge with the double wedding ring block. Those curves are going to constantly be there, and you have to work with them. And so I'm going to start pinning and talking to you about what to do to get this in here. One of the little things I'll show you right now is that you don't sew to the very end of this red, well, in my case red, but very end of part E. Notice I have 1/4 of an inch left that I did not sew. We stop sewing at the dot that you put on. So you want to make sure you leave the 1/4 of an inch at the end free. We will use those for something else later. So that's why those dots are crucial. We don't sew past them. Also notice we didn't sew on part D. The part E comes up to D and stops. And later on, we're going to sew D together with another D. All right, let me get this one pinned in, following the same process that we did before when you were watching me put the arc on. I had a center identified. Here it is. And I'm going to match the seam to my crease and then flip it over to sew from the other side. You never want to sew from the arc side. Always sew from the fabric side over here. That's crucial. That's important in putting together any and all parts of this block. Make sure that when you start sewing, you're sewing from the E side, the fabric side, and not the arc. Now that I've put another pin here, and I want you to notice, I'm going to turn this around in a minute so you can see exactly where I'm pinning, because this is important. I'm putting the dot, that dot, directly on top of that seam right there. So there's my dot here, and the seam, get the pin in there, and I'm going to put it on this seam. You can see the seam right there, because that's where I want to stop sewing. And I do that for each corner of E. Okay, now I'm free to pin the other end. And once again, I want the dot. Well, in this case, I've already sewn part of it, but you can still see that I'm going to match this seam with the seam that I sewed before, and they will intersect right at the dot. Now I'm ready to do some snipping, and to make sure that the curves will fit in nicely as they should. And this came loose. Let me put it back, because this is crucial. Of all the things, this doesn't want to be cooperative. Okay, it's pinned there now, and you can see that dot laying on top of the seam allowance. All right, so now I can do a little bit of clipping to make sure that I can get these curves to behave and to fit together the way they should. Just be careful that you don't cut into the seam line. So your snips are all going to be in the seam allowance. And it's up to you how many snips you think you need to put there in order to make things fit. One suggestion I have for doing this is that you will use a product such as magic sizing on your fabric before you cut anything out. I've noticed that my African fabrics really respond very well to magic sizing. They get just stiff enough to hold their shape. I guess it has to do with the way they're woven, but they just truly respond well to magic sizing. And if you notice, this E is kind of stiff, and that's because I treated it with magic sizing before I cut it out. And I suggest that you do that too, because the fabrics will lay for you a lot better, and you'll have fewer frustrations with fabrics moving about. So keep that in mind as you work with your African fabrics for this project or any project. Give them a good soaking of magic sizing, not a spray starch. I'm not a fan of spray starch because so often it leaves flakes, but magic sizing does not leave flakes. And it just gives the fabric such a nice stiffness. Now, if you look here, you can see my snips. See, as I pull on the fabric, see those snips are opening up a little bit? That's what you want. They help you to move that fabric on the top with that, so that you don't get any wrinkles or puckers on the arc at the bottom. And everything fits snugly as it should. So that's why you snip. It allows you to do a little bit of tugging. Don't yank and pull, but a little bit of tugging of the fabric on top so that that fabric will fit onto the arc underneath. And I want you to do as I'm doing. Take your time and pin. Some of you are kind of anxious right now. You want me to finish pinning and start sewing. But I want you to just take your time with this block, because this block has a lot of little places just waiting to trap you. And so you don't want it to do that. You want to be able to be the conqueror of the block and create it with very little frustration and very few uses of the seam ripper. Okay, I'm going to stitch this one now. And I start stitching right at the white dot. Remember, I'm not going to stitch all the way to the end of that red fabric, but I'm putting my needle in on the dot. Another good reason for sewing with the E fabric up is you can see where your snips are. And if one did get a little bit too long, you're watching them and you can adjust what you need to adjust as you see that. But you do want to keep small snips. They shouldn't be any more than a 16th to an eighth of an inch. And once again, take your time, sew slowly. This isn't like those patterns we put together where we have just long straight sides and you can go a little bit faster. Curves require us to slow down. And I know when I get over here, I can't see the red dot, but I can see the seam allowance. And I know when I get there, I need to stop stitching. Okay, we'll give that a good pressing and then let you see it. I like it. Okay, now we have two of these units on to our background fabric. This is the one I just put on. This is the one I had put on earlier, just so you could see what we're aiming to do. And now I have to put the one on that goes here and the one here. And I'm going to do that off camera, and when I come back, I'll show you what this looks like with all four of those units attached. Okay, quilters, I have now put all four of our football, I guess, segments or parts together, and they're all on E. And so we've got our finished block, our double wedding ring block. which made in these African fabrics is very, very pretty. And of course, mine is scrappy. You could do it so that it's not scrappy. You could use all the same colors in each arc, or change it however you feel that your creativity tells you to change it. But this is the completed block, and this is what you will want when you complete yours. The interesting thing about this, however, is that it is not a 12-inch block. And so my suggestion, when you get ready to put it in your quilt with the 12-inch blocks you've made throughout the year in the block of the month group, you might want to applique it onto something big, a square of fabric that is larger than this diameter, and then put that in the middle of your quilt or in some place where it gets the focus, and then put your other 12-inch blocks around it. You treat that however you wish, but here is your double wedding ring block using our African fabrics. I enjoyed doing this with you, and I look forward to completing another block with you at a later date. Goodbye.